They said my singer belonged in a museum, and then he laughed like he'd done me a favor by saying it out loud. I remember the glass in his hand catching the kitchen light, the stem pinched between his fingers as if even the wine might misbehave, without supervision, and I remember my daughter's quick, apologetic smile, the one she uses when she wants to iron the moment flat so it will slide under a rug and disappear. And I remember how the word museum didn't mean reverence in his mouth. It meant dust and obsolescence and pity disguised as charm. And I stood there with my spool of navy thread and the hem of a dish towel gathered between my fingers, feeling as if someone had reached into the center of my chest and turned down a dial that controlled the brightness of my life. I am Evelyn, 74 years old, widow of a man who once brought home this machine with his paycheck wrapped around the instruction booklet like a ribbon, and who said, in that half-embarrassed tone men used to use when love meant buying something sturdy, that if my hands wanted to make things, then the house had better be ready to hold them, and I still live in the little cedar-sided place we built when knees were nimble and calendars were excuses to invite people over, and the singer sits where it has always sat, beside the window that opens toward the maple tree and the street that has learned my morning habits, and I still oil its throat and polish its faceplate and dab a cloth where the dust settles like a secret that refuses to leave. And when the sun comes through the blinds at the right angle, the whole corner gleams like something holy. They had come for Sunday lunch, which used to mean a roast that perfumed the hall and a bowl of something green that never converted anyone but made us all feel virtuous, though now it means a bag from a place with a chalkboard menu and compostable, forks that snap if you look at them wrong, and it means a schedule that tightens like a belt, and a string of remarks meant to pass as kindness. And I had been mending that old dish towel the way you pick up a shell at the beach, not because it's worth much, but because it is yours. When Greg leaned against the counter in the posture of men who believe every room is their armchair and said that we live in a world where people buy what they need. And my daughter added softly that maybe I would be happier with something lighter and quieter and more modern, something that threaded itself and sang lullabies to lonely grandmothers. And if there had been a camera, the moment would have looked benign. A domestic scene in tasteful colors, the old woman absorbed in her hobby while the young professionals sparkle. But inside my bones, a different picture formed. One where a life built from steady hands and stubborn love was being nudged toward the garage shelf where forgotten things go to acquire their final layer of dust. I don't perform my age the way they expect. I don't tremble for effect or blink in grateful surprise when someone opens a jar. But I know what time does to a body, and I honor it by moving slowly when I must and quickly when it counts. And it counts. To me, that this machine is not a toy and not a knick-knack and not a sentimental trap. It is the instrument by which I made dresses when we had more imagination than money, and Halloween costumes when my daughter believed she could be anything except kind forever, and curtains for the kitchen, whose crooked hem still makes me smile because it was sewn with a baby on my hip, and aprons splattered with the history of 100 dinners that mattered precisely because no one took a picture. And I can feel so when embarrassment and folded it into the drawer with the tea towels, and I made coffee while they discussed a new show about lifestyle efficiencies, and I nodded at the right beats, and I watched my daughter's eyes slide across my machine as if it were a stubborn stain to be lifted by the miracle product of the week. It's a curious thing, The way love changes texture when people decide that helping you means imagining your life without your consent. And I have discovered that the cruelty of gentle voices can bruise just as deeply as the cruelty that shouts. And that the room grows colder, not when someone slams a door, but when they open a window and tell you the breeze is for your own good. And I am not foolish. I know they worry in the way the world teaches them to worry, with articles and apps and the steady drumbeat of safety and liability, and I know my kitchen is not arranged the way a consultant would approve, and that my habits include using things until they've given up all their usefulness and still finding a way to coax more. But I also know a possession can be a promise you once made to yourself, the promise that your hands would not go idle even when you are no longer the axis on which a household turns, and to be mocked for keeping that promise by a man who has never stitched a button is the sort of small humiliation that grows roots if you let it. Outside, the maple tree was shedding its early summer dust, and the street hummed with the kind of Sunday traffic that tells you people are visiting gardens and grocery stores and mothers they tolerate. And I remember the click of the front gate, because Greg never learned that you have to lift it slightly so it doesn't stick. And I remember the way my daughter called from the hallway that they couldn't stay long because there was a home store to visit for a shelving solution. And I said, of course, and meant nothing by it, except that I have mastered the grammar of surrender. And while the coffee dripped and the machine sat there like a dog who knows it is in trouble without understanding why, I thought of my husband's hands, the way they smelled faintly of motor oil and biscuits, and the way he'd say, every Christmas without fail, that we should tighten a screw or two and clean the feed dogs while Bing Crosby kept time in the background, and how he would blow the dust from the bobbin case with a puff that turned into a kiss when he glanced up and saw what my hands had made. People say time softens the outlines of pain, but I think it clarifies them. The way a photograph develops in a darkroom until the face you were trying to recognize emerges. And what I saw as I stood there pretending to listen was not a man being cruel for sport, though he enjoys the sound of his own cleverness, but a younger version of the world my daughter chose when she married him. A world where history is a prop and usefulness is measured by silence. And I wanted to tell them that I have been quiet enough. That quiet was the tax I paid to have a say at all. That quiet is not the same as peace. But instead, I offered scones I had taken from the freezer and warmed in the oven. And he declined with the vague gesture of people who confuse preference with superiority, and my daughter thanked me without eating, and they left the plates tidy on the counter because crumbs are apparently a moral failing now. And after they were gone, and the house had its ordinary music back, the creak of the hallway and the gossip of the kettle and the soft complaint of the back step, I stood with my palms on the machine and tried to understand the sadness that kept spilling into my mouth like a taste I couldn't name. I am not sentimental by profession. I don't sit on the edge of my bed at night and count grievances as if they were coins. But I will tell you that there are objects that carry the weight of the promises we survived, and there are sentences that, once spoken, tilt the floor beneath you. And hearing my life's companion called a museum piece by a man who thinks skill arrives in a cardboard box with a charger was one of those tilts. And I would be lying if I said I did not, for a moment, imagine wheeling the singer to the curb and letting the junk truck swallow it. Imagined the relief in my daughter's eyes. Imagined the way the living room would look larger and cleaner and emptier in a way that some people call serenity. But then I thought of my granddaughter with her paint-stained fingers and her tendency to sit too close, watching the needle take its tiny bites out of time. And I thought of the quilt my mother finished the year my father left, and how she said that you can stitch a life back together if you are willing to accept that the seams will show. And I dried my hands and opened the little tin where I keep the good needles, and I threaded one just to prove my hands still remembered the choreography. When the bobbin hums, the house answers. It really does. The floorboards find a steadier breath. The clock behaves. The kettle doesn't throw its tantrum. And I felt it then, that alignment of purpose and place, as if I had opened a door that the afternoon was grateful for. And I told myself, not with defiance, but with a clarity that surprised me, that nobody who has eaten at my table and slept beneath my roof and tucked their feet under the Afghan I knitted out of the boring television months gets to decide which of my possessions are relics and which are engines, and I promised the machine, because we have our rituals, that I would not apologize for it again. I washed the cups and placed them mouth down on the rack and wiped the counter and lifted the machine's cover the way you lift a curtain before a performance, and the smell of metal and oil and thread greeted me like an old friend, and I sat, not because my back insisted, but because I wanted the ritual of lowering myself into the chair that has warmed to the shape of my work, and I pressed my foot down gently, just once, to hear that first low note that has always seemed to tell me I will not be erased, not today, not while I can make a line where there wasn't one, not while cloth is willing to become something it wasn't a moment ago, and the sentence Greg left in my kitchen broke apart the way a crumb does under a steady finger. And I let it fall, and I began, very softly, to plan. I did not touch the machine for 2 days after that Sunday. It sat on the table like a witness who had seen too much, and every time I walked past, I felt the weight of its silence, heavy and patient. I told myself it was only a tool, a collection of parts, nothing mystical about it. But the truth is that I could not look at it without feeling the sting of humiliation crawl back under my skin. I had endured the small indignities of age before, patronizing smiles from doctors, well-meaning neighbors speaking loudly as if deafness were contagious. But this was different. This was betrayal in the shape of laughter, delivered by someone who believed his opinion about beauty and utility was law. The next morning, my daughter called to tell me they had talked about my situation and thought it best to modernize a few things in the house. She spoke in that syrupy tone reserved for toddlers and patients. "Mom, we just don't want you struggling with that old machine. Greg can order you a new one that does everything automatically." She waited for praise. I said I was fine with what I had, but she kept going, explaining how the new models thread themselves, how they're lightweight and safe, how they have digital patterns built in so I wouldn't have to strain my eyes. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I prefer to decide for myself what safety means, but she heard only stubbornness. "You're always so attached to old things," she sighed, and then she hung up after promising they would stop by next weekend to help me sort things out. When they arrived, it was raining, a slow, silver kind of rain that makes everything smell like memory. Greg went straight to the kitchen, not even bothering with his usual polite greetings. He clapped his hands and said, "All right, let's clear a little space in here." Before I could ask what he meant, he lifted the sewing machine off the table as if it were a box of junk and carried it toward the garage. I told him to stop, that it belonged where it was, but he laughed. "We don't want you tripping over this antique. I'll keep it safe until we get the new one." My daughter trailed behind him, muttering that he was only trying to help. I stood there, useless, my hands fluttering at my sides like moths that had lost their light. The sound of the rain on the roof mixed with the clatter of the machine being set down on the cold concrete. And I thought how cruelly ordinary betrayal sounds when it happens inside your own home. They left soon after, satisfied with their good deed, and the house filled again with that lonely stillness that arrives only when something essential has been taken. I went into the garage later, careful not to let the door squeal. The machine sat there under a thin film of dust already settling from the air, surrounded by paint cans and a stack of plastic bins. Its cord hung limp, coiled like a discarded vein. I ran my hand over the metal body and felt the coolness seep into my skin. "They don't know you," I whispered, and my voice cracked because I wasn't talking only about the machine. I was thinking of my husband, of how he once said that a home dies not when people leave it, but when its work is done by strangers. For days I drifted through the rooms as if the walls had grown taller, and I had shrunk. I made tea I didn't drink. I turned on the television only to mute it again. I even tried reading, but the letters slipped through my mind like fish in dark water. The absence of the singer in its corner was an ache that nothing could fill. My daughter texted pictures of sleek, white machines, all curved edges and cheerful screens. "Look how cute this one is," she wrote, as if the word cute had ever applied to anything that mattered. I didn't answer. The next morning, Greg sent a message. "I can stop by Saturday to pick up the old cords and foot pedal. No point keeping all that junk." I stared at the words until they blurred, and something inside me, something that had been patient and polite and endlessly accommodating, began to shift. That night, unable to sleep, I went into the garage with a small lamp. The light pooled around the machine like a secret ceremony. I sat on an overturned crate and studied it. The paint was chipped at the corners, and there was a small nick near the wheel where my husband once dropped a screwdriver, but everything else was intact. I pressed the pedal gently, just to hear it hum, and the sound that rose was not mechanical, but alive, steady, defiant, familiar. The noise filled the small space, blending with the rhythm of the rain outside, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something like anger that was not bitter, but pure. I realized then that what they had stolen was not a possession, but permission, the right to decide what in my life was still useful. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I brewed coffee strong enough to taste like memory and opened the window to let the cool air touch my face. The maple tree outside was dripping rainwater like quiet applause. I carried the lamp back to the garage, turned the switch, and began to clean the machine. I wiped every surface with oil, tightened the screws, checked the tension of the belt. My fingers remembered the order even though my mind had forgotten some of the words. By the time the sun reached the edge of the driveway, the singer gleamed again, dignified and ready. I tested a few stitches on a scrap of fabric, and each one came out straight and confident, as if the machine had been waiting for this small rebellion. Later that afternoon, my daughter called again. "Did Greg leave the garage door open? The smell of oil is all over the car." I told her I had been cleaning, and she sighed the way people do when they think you're being difficult. "Please don't hurt yourself, Mom. We're only trying to make things easier." I looked at the spool of thread in my hand and thought how easy it is to strangle something with good intentions. I said I was fine, that they needn't worry, and hung up before the lecture could begin. I spent the evening in the garage, testing different fabrics, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the needle. It sounded like a pulse that belonged only to me. I remembered the first dress I ever made, a blue cotton thing with uneven seams, and how proud I was to wear something that my own hands had created. I remembered my daughter's first Halloween, the yellow wings I stayed up all night sewing because she wanted to be the sun. That dress had been stitched on this very machine, and when she twirled in the morning light, I thought no one could ever make me feel smaller than the joy in that moment. But memory is cruelly tender. It keeps showing you the people who left before you were ready to stop needing them. By the time the streetlights flickered on, I had a plan. I would bring the machine back inside where it belonged, and I would make something worthy of all the silence I had swallowed. I did not yet know what it would be, but I knew it would have to speak for me when words failed. 2 days later, Greg returned with his usual casual authority. He knocked once and entered before I could answer. "Hey, just grabbing that old pedal," he said, heading straight to the garage. I followed, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that accompanies the recognition of a line being crossed. When he opened the door, the machine was gone. The table was empty except for a folded cloth. "Where is it?" he asked, half amused, half irritated. I said it was where it should be. He turned, confused. "In the house? Mom, that's dangerous. Those cords are ancient." I smiled in a way that made him pause. "Then I guess we'll find out if age really is as dangerous as you think." He left muttering about stubborn old habits. I watched his car disappear down the street. And when I turned back toward the living room, the sight of the singer waiting in its rightful corner made my chest tighten with something sharp and luminous. I sat down beside it and placed a new piece of fabric beneath the needle, a deep burgundy cotton I had saved from an old dress, and began to sew. The needle pierced the cloth with deliberate grace, and I imagined each stitch as a word I hadn't said, a sentence reclaiming its voice. The hum grew steadier, louder, until it filled the house completely. When my daughter called that evening, I didn't answer. I kept sewing. The fabric warmed under my hands. The thread formed small rivers of red across its surface, and I thought of how easily the language of love can be rewritten as condescension. The singer did not protest. It sang, and I let it. That was the night I understood that defiance need not roar. Sometimes it hums softly under the breath, steady as a heartbeat, determined as memory, waiting for the world to notice what it has already lost. I woke on Tuesday to the sound of the garbage truck rumbling down the street, the kind of low mechanical growl that vibrates through the window panes and rattles in your chest. It reminded me, absurdly, of the singer's own hum, though the truck lacked all grace and mercy. I sat up slowly, joints protesting in their usual morning dialect, and looked at the corner of the living room where the machine sat now. I had moved it back into its place the previous evening, pushing the small table across the floor inch by inch, steadying the legs with folded napkins where the wood had warped. The singer seemed to glow faintly in the gray light, a dark, loyal creature waiting for its master. I realized then how long I had been moving around my own home as a guest, careful not to disturb anything that might signal to my daughter and her husband that I was still inconveniently alive. The return of the machine to its rightful place was like a pulse beneath the skin, something almost secret, almost subversive. It felt like breathing without permission. For the next week, I tried to resume the rhythm of my days, though everything now carried a different texture, as if reality itself had been sanded down. I noticed small changes that I must have ignored before. My daughter had rearranged the cupboards during one of her visits, putting the plates on a higher shelf to give me more counter space. The counter itself was spotless, too spotless, as if she feared the residue of use. She had replaced my sturdy wooden spoon with a sleek plastic one that bent under the weight of soup. Even the towels were new, pale gray, no embroidery, no color, just compliance. When I reached for my old checkered cloths, I discovered they were gone, quietly removed like contraband. At first, I told myself it didn't matter, that things are only things. But the loss of those everyday objects carried an intimacy of insult. Each disappearance was a message whispered behind my back. You are being edited. One afternoon, I heard the soft click of the mailbox and saw an envelope on the mat, thick paper with cheerful lettering that announced a delivery from Modern Home Solutions. Inside was a brochure advertising the latest sewing machines, all white and pastel, their features listed like moral virtues: safety lock, automatic threading, ergonomic design. The enclosed note read, "Thought of you, love, L." I placed it on the table without opening the rest. I did not need to see the smiling woman on the cover, her silver hair arranged like an apology, her perfect machine glowing under perfect light. I knew what story they wanted me to live in, a sanitized version of usefulness, where everything was smooth and unthreatening and therefore good. But I had lived long enough to know that real work leaves marks, that beauty comes with noise, and that love, when genuine, makes a mess of every surface it touches. Still, I could feel their presence in every corner of the house, even when they were not here. Greg's words echoed between the rooms like an odor that refused to fade. My daughter's careful tidying began to feel less like affection and more like erasure, disguised as efficiency. They meant well, I told myself, the way people mean well when they plant trees in someone else's garden. Yet each gesture took something small and irreplaceable. I found myself speaking less on the phone, nodding through conversations where my voice no longer seemed required. When she asked if I had been out lately, I said yes, though my outings were brief walks to the end of the street and back, just enough to remind my body that distance still existed. It was on one of those walks that I noticed a new family moving into the house 2 doors down. A woman about my age was directing 2 young men carrying furniture through the door. She wore a faded blue cardigan, and her hair was pinned up haphazardly. Our eyes met for a second, and she smiled with the tired grace of someone who knows too much about starting over. I smiled back, a small exchange, but it lingered with me the whole way home. It made me wonder when I had last been seen without being evaluated. That evening, I brewed tea and sat by the singer, tracing the scratches on its surface with my fingertip. I began to remember things I had not allowed myself to think about in years. The pattern books I kept in the hall closet, the old box of fabric scraps under the bed, the unfinished projects folded neatly and forgotten after my husband died. There was a skirt I had promised my daughter when she was 16, a patchwork of blue and cream squares we chose together one spring afternoon. I had sewn half of it before she decided she wanted something store-bought instead, and I folded the half-made piece away, telling myself I would finish it someday. I got up and found the box, blew off the dust, and opened it. Inside lay the fabric, still bright, still waiting. I realized, almost with amusement, that it had outlasted most of the people it was made for. I laid it across my lap and began to unpick the old seams, careful not to tear the cloth. The thread came loose like a sigh. By the time the evening news began its empty chatter, I was sewing again. The needle dipped and rose, and I felt the steadiness return to my hands. The next morning, my daughter arrived unannounced. She let herself in, as she often did, using the spare key I had given her years ago when trust still felt uncomplicated. She stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the living room. "You moved it back," she said, meaning the singer. Her voice was calm but tight. I told her I needed it where I could see it. "Mom, we talked about this." I smiled and asked her to sit down. She didn't. She looked at the fabric spread across the table. "You're not planning to start sewing again, are you? You'll strain your eyes. And that pedal, it could spark." I told her I had been sewing for 50 years without incident. She sighed, exasperated. "You're impossible." I wanted to say that impossible women built the world she takes for granted, but I held my tongue. She picked up a square of fabric, examined it, and said, "It's pretty, I guess, but don't overdo it." Then she left, closing the door with that careful precision that says more than slamming ever could. After she was gone, I sat in the quiet and laughed. Not out of humor, but out of disbelief at how small the world of concern had become. They worried about sparks, but not about silence. They worried about safety, but not about dignity. I began to notice other small exiles. The framed photographs of my parents, once on the mantel, had been moved to a box in the closet to make space. My husband's old coat had vanished from the hall rack, donated without consultation. Even my garden had been interfered with. Greg had trimmed the roses down to blunt stumps last autumn, declaring it necessary for maintenance. Now, in spring, only a few brave buds had returned, stubborn and uneven. I looked at them from the window and felt a kinship I hadn't expected. Survival doesn't always bloom beautifully, but it blooms all the same. I started spending my evenings with the singer again, slowly reclaiming my house through small acts of noise. The sound of the needle became a rhythm of ownership. I stitched pieces of the old skirt into something new, not clothing, not yet a quilt, just fragments joined for the sake of connection. As I worked, I listened to the creak of the floorboards, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the faint pulse of the neighborhood outside, and I realized how much of living is simply refusing to go silent. Each night, I left the finished squares folded neatly beside the machine, and each morning, I woke to find them waiting like loyal companions. Then came the Sunday call. Greg's voice this time, brisk and managerial. "Lisa says you've been staying up late. You should really be careful with your eyesight." I asked how he knew. He said the neighbors mentioned they'd seen the light on. "They worry, seeing you up at all hours." I wanted to ask if I owed the neighborhood an apology for existing, but I simply said I was fine. He cleared his throat and said, "We just want you to have the best, Mom. Maybe it's time to downsize a little. A condo, maybe? No stairs, less upkeep." I felt something cold slide into my chest. The plan was unfolding, a smaller life wrapped in words like comfort and safety. "I like my house," I said. "It knows me." He laughed lightly, a sound with no warmth. "We'll talk about it when you're ready." The line went dead. That night I couldn't focus on sewing. The words condo and downsizing circled my thoughts like vultures. I walked through each room, touching furniture, walls, the cool edge of the sink, trying to memorize the texture of everything they might soon call clutter. I reached the garage and opened the old wooden cabinet where my husband kept his tools. Inside, among rusted wrenches and half-empty cans of paint, I found a small tin box. It held the receipt from the singer's purchase, yellowed and brittle. The price was printed in faded ink, $89.90. I held it as one holds a relic, not for its monetary worth, but for its insistence on history. He had bought it 2 weeks after we were married, when we still lived in a rented room with one lamp. The machine was our first shared investment, and I remember his grin when he brought it home, proud as if he'd built it himself. To sell it, to upgrade it, would be to amputate the beginning of us. I placed the receipt in an envelope and tucked it under the cushion of my chair, a small insurance against oblivion. Days passed, the weather softened, and the maple outside the window began to leaf again. Life, for all its betrayals, refused to stop moving. I found myself working more intently, piecing together not just fabric, but fragments of my own persistence. Sometimes the needle snagged on thick seams, sometimes the thread broke, but each interruption felt like proof that I was still capable of repair. The air around me changed, richer somehow, scented faintly with oil and cotton, and something older, resistance maybe. I no longer turned on the television. The singer's hum was enough. By the end of the week, the first real piece emerged. A panel made from the remains of 3 old garments: my husband's plaid shirt, my daughter's childhood dress, and one of my own aprons. The colors clashed beautifully, like an argument that ends in truth. I draped it over the back of the chair and stared at it for a long time. It looked like belonging, imperfect and undeniable. I realized then that this was not nostalgia. It was reclamation. Every stitch was a way of saying I was still here, still making, still deciding. I didn't yet know that this quiet insistence would be the beginning of the storm, that small acts of defiance have a way of echoing louder than anyone expects. But I could feel the tremor building in the air, as if the house itself had begun to remember its original owner. The change began quietly, so quietly that I almost didn't notice it, like a thread sliding through fabric without catching the light. It started with the letter I found at the back of the drawer, hidden under a pile of old recipes and birthday cards. I wasn't looking for it, not really. I had been searching for a pair of scissors that always managed to vanish when I needed them. The envelope was yellowed and unsealed, the handwriting mine but uncertain, the ink slightly blurred, as if written on a day when I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. I unfolded it and read the first line. Dear Lily, I don't know if I will ever send this to you, but there are things I want you to remember about the women you come from. I felt my throat tighten, and I sat down right there on the floor, surrounded by the smell of paper and dust and time. I had written it years ago, after my husband died, and before my daughter had become a stranger with familiar eyes. I never sent it because I didn't think my granddaughter, barely 12 then, would understand. But reading it now, I realized it wasn't meant for a child. It was meant for me. The words were steady, full of a kind of clarity I had lost somewhere along the way. Don't let them make you smaller to fit their idea of comfort. Remember that making things with your hands is not a sign of poverty, but of presence. Every woman in our family has stitched something that outlasted her. One day you will too. I folded the letter carefully, pressing its creases back into memory, and for a long while, I just sat there listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Something inside me stirred, a pulse I hadn't felt in years. I thought of Lily, now grown, studying art somewhere far away, sending me pictures of unfinished canvases and coffee cups and the shadows on her studio wall. She was the only one who never looked at my old machine as an inconvenience. When she was little, she used to sit cross-legged on the floor, holding scraps of fabric to her cheek, saying she liked how the colors made noise. I hadn't realized how much I missed that phrase until it returned to me now, fluttering around the quiet house like a bird that had finally found its window open. That evening, I brought the singer closer to the window, dusted the table, and set out the box of fabric squares. The air was heavy with rain again, and the sound of drops against the glass created a rhythm that my hands began to follow. I didn't plan what to make. I simply let the pieces choose one another, each small square of cloth finding its place beside another, guided by instinct and memory. As the hours passed, the room filled with that low, comforting hum, and I felt the years fall away, not in the sentimental sense of growing young again, but in the deeper, truer way of becoming whole. I was no longer stitching to prove anything. I was sewing to remember myself. When I looked up, the clock read midnight. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain and something else. Something alive. I stood and stretched, and for a moment I felt almost foolishly light, as if the house itself had begun to breathe with me. The quilt in the making lay across the table like a sleeping creature, uneven and imperfect, but unmistakably mine. I covered it with a clean sheet and turned off the light. The machine clicked softly as it cooled, like a heart settling into rest. In the morning, I woke earlier than usual, and the first thought that crossed my mind was not about breakfast or pain in my knees, but about thread color. I boiled water for tea and carried my cup to the window. The maple tree outside was shedding its last blossoms, pale petals gathering like tiny notes on the grass. I realized how long it had been since I had noticed something so simple, so quietly beautiful. I felt the smallest surge of gratitude, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but simply expands inside your chest until breathing feels like permission again. The following days unfolded in that new rhythm, neither fast nor slow, just deliberate. I began to gather fabrics from everywhere, old dresses, pillowcases, even a curtain torn long ago by the wind. Each piece carried a ghost. The dress my daughter wore on her first day of school, the checkered cloth from our old kitchen table, the blue floral sheet from the summer. My husband and I slept with the windows open to let in the sound of crickets. I washed and ironed each scrap, laying them out in piles across the floor. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the whisper of fabric, the soft hiss of steam, the occasional sigh of the old machine. I worked slowly, my body reminding me of its limits, but there was joy in those limits. I liked the ache in my shoulders, the pricks on my fingertips. They were proof of effort, of existence. It was during one of these afternoons that my daughter called. Her voice came through the receiver, bright and rushed. "We might stop by tomorrow, Mom. Greg's found something on sale for you, a new model. You'll love it. It has a touch screen." I smiled to myself, staring at the half-finished patchwork on the table. "That's kind of you," I said softly. "But I'm working on something right now." There was a pause, a long silence on her end, and then, "Working on what?" "A quilt," I said. "For Lily." She laughed, but it wasn't unkind, just uncertain. "You're After a moment, she said, "Well, don't strain yourself. We'll talk tomorrow." When the call ended, I felt the air in the room shift again. Their words no longer hurt the way they once did. They rolled off like water on wax. It wasn't that I had forgiven them. It was simply that I had stopped expecting them to understand. My work was not for them. It was for the girl who once called color a sound, and for the woman who was learning, at 74, to speak again through fabric. I threaded the needle with a deep golden thread, a color I hadn't used before, and began to stitch a border around the new section. The thread caught the light as it moved, glinting like a vein of sunlight pulled through cloth. That evening, I received an unexpected message from Lily. It was a photograph of her new painting, a swirl of blues and reds, and something like coppered dust across the canvas. The caption read, "I miss the sound of your machine." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightening with something tender and fierce. I typed back, "It misses you too." Then, after a pause, I added, "I'm making something for you." She replied with a single heart, and that was enough. The next morning, I returned to my work with a new kind of focus. The quilt began to take shape, no longer random pieces, but deliberate choices. I placed a strip of my husband's plaid shirt near the center, then added a corner of my daughter's childhood dress beside it, a silent acknowledgement of what we had been and what we had lost. Around them, I stitched fragments of my own life, an apron, a sleeve, a curtain, until the fabric became a map of time itself. The machine's hum filled the house like prayer, steady and patient. As days turned into a week, I noticed subtle changes in myself. The house no longer felt like a waiting room. I moved through it with purpose, humming under my breath, eating when I was hungry, resting when I was tired. The quiet that used to weigh on me now felt like space, room enough to think, to create, to remember. Sometimes I even caught myself smiling at nothing, the way people do when a memory brushes against them gently. I realized that I had crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer reacting to the world they imposed. I was rebuilding the one I had nearly abandoned. When my daughter and Greg arrived that Sunday, they found me at the table, needle poised, the quilt draped across my lap. Greg carried a large box, glossy and white, with a logo that screamed efficiency. "Surprise," he said. "Your new machine." I looked up at him, then at the box, and said, "That's very thoughtful, but I don't need it." His smile faltered. "At least open it," he insisted. My daughter placed a hand on his arm, uneasy. "Mom, it's just a gift. You don't have to use it." I nodded and said, "Then I won't." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at the quilt, then back at me. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked. "A story," I said. "One you probably won't read." He laughed uncertainly and turned away. They stayed only a short while. When they left, I felt no anger, only calm. The confrontation I had dreaded for months had come and gone like a passing storm. I sat back down and continued sewing, the golden thread running smooth beneath my fingers. The house, once stripped of meaning, now seemed to hum with quiet approval. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the window in time with the needle. It occurred to me then that redemption rarely arrives as a revelation. More often, it slips in softly, disguised as an ordinary day. I sewed until my eyes blurred, and the world narrowed to the sound of fabric and breath. And for the first time in years, I felt entirely unafraid of the future. It was a Thursday in late September, when the air began to smell faintly of smoke from someone's fireplace down the street, that first sign of the season turning inward. And I had been sitting at the table since morning, the singer's rhythm steady, almost hypnotic, my hands working without thought, my body bent toward purpose. The quilt had grown so large now that it spilled onto the floor, a river of memory winding through the small room. Each square carried a fragment of a story. The faded print from my daughter's childhood curtains, a strip from the dress I wore the day I buried my husband, a corner of the apron that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and onions and long years of dinners shared and unshared. I had stitched without a plan, but somehow the pattern had arranged itself into something deliberate, an order only visible after surrendering to instinct. The center square had formed almost by accident, a deep burgundy patch that drew the eye and held it. It reminded me of the heart of an apple, dark and sweet and secret. I knew something was beginning there, though I could not yet name it. The phone rang just as I was finishing a seam, the sound harsh in the quiet. I ignored it at first, but it persisted with the stubborn cheerfulness of people who assume their calls are invitations rather than interruptions. You can't just ignore things like that, she said, her voice rising slightly, the way it does when irritation dresses itself as concern. Greg's worried the wiring in that old room isn't safe. He's planning to come over tonight and take a look. I said I was fine, that everything worked. But she spoke over me, promising they'd bring dinner and sort things out. I wanted to protest, to tell her I didn't need sorting, but I felt suddenly tired of explaining what she had decided not to hear. So I said nothing. By the time evening came, the air outside had grown cool and sharp. I heard their car before I saw it, the quick slam of doors, the brisk rhythm of steps on the path. I didn't get up to greet them. They entered, calling my name as if the house were a stage and they the rescuers arriving for the final act. My daughter carried a casserole dish, and Greg had his toolbox slung casually in one hand. He walked straight toward the living room, scanning the space with the expression of a man inspecting a problem. "Wow," he said after a moment. "You've really made a mess here." The quilt stretched across the table and floor like a landscape, colorful and unapologetic. "It's not a mess," I said quietly. "It's work." He crouched down to touch one of the squares. "You're still using that thing?" he asked, gesturing toward the singer. "I thought we agreed." "We didn't," I said, sharper than intended. My daughter tried to laugh it off. "She's been busy, obviously," she said, giving me that look she used to give her daughter when she wanted to smooth the edges of an argument. Greg stood, brushing his hands against his jeans. "It's impressive, I guess, if you like that kind of thing. But you should really unplug it when you're not using it. These old wires, one spark and the whole place could go up." He crossed to the wall and tugged at the plug without asking. The machine gave a small sigh as it powered down, and something inside me went still. Dinner was awkward. The casserole sat untouched on the counter while they talked about home insurance and retirement plans, and I listened without responding. My daughter asked if I'd considered selling the house. "It's too big for you, Mom. And Greg's found a lovely place near us. You'd have your own space, a balcony, everything new and safe." I stared at the steam rising from the food, watching it curl and disappear. "This is my space," I said. "I built it." She looked at me as though I had said something childish. "You don't have to make everything so difficult. We're offering to help." Greg added, "It's not about control, you know. It's about what's best for everyone." I nearly laughed at that, the arrogance of everyone spoken by someone who meant only himself. Instead, I said softly, "You mistake your comfort for my safety." That silenced them for a moment, long enough for me to stand and begin clearing the plates they hadn't touched. My daughter reached out as if to stop me, then let her hand fall. After they left, the house felt heavier, the air thick with the residue of words unsaid. I went to the machine and plugged it back in. It started immediately, the motor purring, as if waiting for me to return. I worked late into the night, the needle stitching out my anger, my fear, my love, until the quilt grew too heavy to move. Each patch was a heartbeat, each seam a sentence I could not speak aloud. I realized that what I was making was not just for Lily, but also against forgetting, a resistance stitched in cotton and thread. A few days later, Greg returned alone. I saw his car from the window, gleaming smugly in the driveway. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but something in me refused to hide. I opened the door before he could knock. "Lisa's at work," he said quickly, but she asked me to check on a few things. "The roof, the outlets, you know." I stepped aside without a word. He moved through the house with practiced confidence, opening cupboards, peering behind furniture, all the while offering little comments. "You should really update these," or "this could be a fire hazard." When he reached the living room, he stopped and looked at the quilt again. It had changed since his last visit, nearly complete now, its colors deepened with purpose. He tilted his head, pretending interest. "So this is for Lily, huh? You know she probably won't even take it with her. Kids these days, they don't want sentimental stuff." I smiled faintly. "It's not for her to take. It's for her to remember." He frowned, not understanding. "You're putting a lot of work into something that's just going to sit around." I said, "That's exactly what you think I'm doing, isn't it? Sitting around." His expression hardened. "Lisa worries about you," he said. "You've been isolating yourself. It's not healthy." I wanted to tell him that loneliness is not always an illness, that sometimes it's a sanctuary, but I knew he would only hear defiance. Instead, I gestured toward the door. "You've checked what you needed to. You can go now." He hesitated, perhaps unused to being dismissed by someone he considered frail. But finally, he shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. And as he walked out, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, small, insignificant against the expanse of fabric that filled the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The confrontation replayed in my mind, each word another stitch tightening inside me. I went to the singer, lifted its cover, and began to sew again. The room glowed with the soft light of the lamp, the quilt spreading across the floor like a tapestry of defiance. I added new squares, dark velvet from an old coat, a strip of linen from a pillowcase, lace from the collar of a dress I'd worn to my daughter's wedding. I placed them near the center, around the burgundy square that had become the heart of the piece. Slowly, an image began to form, not planned, but inevitable. A silhouette, broad-shouldered and imposing, stitched in darker tones than the rest. I did not realize until much later that I was making him, Greg, the man who had laughed at my hands and rearranged my life to suit his comfort. His form emerged not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, as if the fabric itself demanded to bear witness to the shape of its adversary. Around him, I stitched fragments of warmth, soft yellows, faded pinks, the remnants of tenderness he would never understand. Days passed, and I worked with a focus that bordered on obsession. My fingers ached, the skin on my thumb cracked, but I didn't stop. Each night, I dreamt of the machine humming like a heartbeat, and each morning, I woke to find another section completed. The house became a cocoon of thread and memory. Neighbors must have noticed the glow from my window, but no one asked. They had learned, perhaps, that some silences are sacred. It was on a Saturday afternoon that Lily arrived unexpectedly. I heard the knock and thought at first it was another unwelcome visit, but when I opened the door, there she was, taller than I remembered, her hair longer, her face older, but still soft around the eyes. "Surprise," she said, smiling. "I had a week off and thought I'd come see you." I pulled her into my arms, and for a moment, everything that had hardened inside me melted. I led her into the living room, and when she saw the quilt, she gasped. "Grandma," she whispered, "this is... wow." She knelt beside it, tracing her fingers over the stitches. "Is this all from our clothes?" I nodded. "Every piece has a story." She pointed to the dark center. "And this?" "That," I said slowly, "is part of the story too." She didn't ask whose shadow it was. She didn't need to. We spent the afternoon talking. She told me about her art classes, about how her professors kept telling her that art must provoke, must make people see what they'd rather ignore. I told her that was true, but that art also remembers what others want to forget. When she looked again at the quilt, I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "Can I take a picture?" she asked. "Of course," I said. She framed it carefully, crouching to catch the light. "I want to show my mentor," she murmured. I didn't know that she had already sent the photograph to a small community art gallery near her campus, or that within a week someone would call me asking if I was the artist behind the textile portrait of family memory. The invitation came in an envelope edged with gold. They wanted to include my quilt in an exhibition about generational stories. I stared at the letter for a long time before laughing aloud, a deep, startled laugh that filled the house. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as someone to be managed, but as someone who had created. I agreed to send the piece. The gallery arranged to collect it, and when they came, 2 young women handled the fabric with reverence, their gloved hands moving carefully across each seam. "It's extraordinary," one said. "The emotion, it feels alive." I nodded, unable to speak. When they left, the house seemed oddly bare, as though part of its soul had gone traveling. The night before the exhibition, my daughter called. "Greg saw the event online," she said, her voice cautious. "He says your quilt looks... well, it looks a lot like us." I said, "That's because it is." Silence stretched between us. Finally, she said, "We'll come." And I, after a pause, replied, "You should." The day of the exhibition was bright and cold. The gallery was small but crowded, people moving slowly from one piece to another, their murmurs blending into a low hum, not unlike the sound of the singer itself. My quilt hung on the central wall, its colors illuminated by a single warm light. I stood near the back, unnoticed, watching as strangers leaned in to study the details. Some smiled, others frowned, unsettled perhaps by the dark shape at the center. I saw Greg before he saw me, standing stiffly in front of the quilt, his hands clasped behind his back, my daughter beside him, her face unreadable. Lily stood nearby, proud and unashamed. When Greg finally turned, his eyes met mine across the room. For once, he had no words. He looked back at the quilt, at his own shadow stitched into its heart, surrounded by fragments of the family he had sought to curate, and something in his expression faltered, as though he understood too late that the story he had tried to control had written itself without his consent. My daughter touched his arm, but he didn't move. I watched them both and felt no triumph, only clarity. The silence between us was its own kind of applause. That night, when I returned home, I placed my hand on the empty table where the singer had stood and whispered, "Thank you." The machine had given me back my voice, not in sound but in creation. Outside, the first leaves began to fall, their edges catching the lamplight like threads of gold. And I thought how even the act of falling can be beautiful when it happens on your own terms. When the exhibition ended, the gallery asked if I would like to keep the quilt there a little longer for their permanent collection, a gesture they described as preservation. But I declined with a kind of quiet certainty I had never felt before. I told them it was not meant to hang behind glass. It was meant to breathe, to live in a house that could still smell the faint traces of fabric softener and dust and Sunday dinners long gone. They seemed disappointed, but polite, as people often are when faced with an old woman's decisions. Lily was the one who came to help me bring it home. I watched her carefully fold each section, her hands gentle, reverent even, and I realized that the act of folding was another kind of creation, compressing all that noise of color and memory into something that could still be carried. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The silence between us was easy, filled with the small hum of the car and the rhythm of the passing world outside. I thought about how strange it felt to see my own life admired, dissected, applauded, when all I had done was survive it. When we reached the house, I laid the quilt on the table again. The light from the window touched it differently now. It no longer looked like something domestic or sentimental, but like a landscape marked by storms and repairs, by stitches that were neither perfect nor ashamed of their imperfection. I traced the seam of the dark center square with one finger, feeling again the depth of that burgundy patch that had grown to symbolize something larger than its origin. It wasn't Greg anymore. It wasn't any one person. It was the weight of all those years of being handled, rearranged, diminished, the shadow of control that had hung over every generous gesture. The realization came slowly, a warmth spreading from the chest outward. I had turned the thing that hurt me into the thing that freed me. Greg and my daughter came the following weekend. I knew they would. They couldn't resist the gravity of something they had dismissed. They arrived without warning, but I was ready. I had brewed tea and left the door unlocked. When they stepped inside, I could feel the tension clinging to them like humidity before a storm. My daughter tried to smile, a strained version of the warmth I remembered from her girlhood. Greg stayed near the door, eyes darting toward the quilt as if it were some unpredictable animal. "We saw all the photos online," my daughter said. "Everyone's talking about it. They called it what was the word? A generational testimony?" She laughed softly, but it wasn't laughter really, more an attempt to fill the space. "It's powerful." I thanked her, though my voice came out steadier than hers. Greg said nothing. His silence was loud in the room, echoing against the walls that had once tolerated his patronizing tone. After a few moments, my daughter asked if she could see the quilt again up close. I nodded and stepped aside. She bent to touch one of the lighter squares, the one made from her childhood dress, and her fingers trembled. "I remember this," she said quietly. "You made it for my 7th birthday." Her voice broke slightly, and she smiled at the memory, though her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "You kept everything." I told her I had kept what mattered. Greg moved closer now, curiosity overcoming discomfort. He studied the dark patch in the center and cleared his throat. "That's an interesting choice of color," he said finally. "A statement masquerading as politeness. It draws the eye." "Yes," I said. "That's the point." He nodded awkwardly, as if he understood, though I could see he didn't. He was a man who feared being the subject of someone else's vision, and now he stood framed by it, powerless to rewrite what had already been sown. The conversation turned to practicalities. My daughter, her eye, you never asked. She winced slightly, as if struck by a truth too simple to argue with. Greg shifted his weight and muttered, "You could have told us. We'd have helped you, with supplies or something." "You already helped," I said, letting the words hang between us like the final stitch in a seam that didn't need reinforcing. He frowned, unsure whether I meant gratitude or accusation, and I didn't clarify. When they left later that afternoon, I felt no relief and no anger, only stillness. It was the stillness that comes after a long illness breaks, a calm that feels almost fragile because of its unfamiliarity. I walked through the house slowly, each step echoing like a question I no longer needed to answer. In the living room, the singer waited, patient and gleaming in the afternoon light. I sat before it, the way one sits before an altar, and laid the quilt across my knees. I had thought it finished, but now I saw small spaces, empty corners that called for something more, not decoration, but closure. I took out my box of thread, searching for a color that could hold an ending. I chose a pale gray, soft as ash. It wasn't sadness. It was balance. As the needle began to move, I felt time stretch, the past and present folding into each other until the air itself seemed to hum in rhythm. I worked through the evening and into the night, the lamp casting a pool of light that made the rest of the room dissolve into shadow. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the smell of rain. The house groaned softly, old bones shifting in their sleep. I stitched the final lines not as words, but as symbols, tiny shapes only I could read, initials, dates, fragments of prayers I no longer said aloud. When the last knot was tied, I leaned back and looked at what I had done. The quilt no longer looked like a collection of remnants. It looked like a single breathing thing, its surface rippling with the story of every woman who had ever been told her usefulness had expired. I ran my palm over it and felt something like forgiveness rising, not for them, but for myself, for the years I spent apologizing for existing in the way I was made to exist. The next morning, Lily called. Her voice was bright, excited. "Grandma, guess what? The gallery director wants to nominate your piece for a national showcase. They're calling it textile realism. Apparently it's the new thing." I laughed softly. "I've never been new in my life," I said. But inside, I felt a quiet thrill. "Will you go?" she asked. "Will you let them display it again?" I thought of the singer, of the long nights and the hum that had carried me back to myself. "Yes," I said. "But this time, I want to be there when they hang it." A month later, I found myself standing in a vast white room in the city, surrounded by people in black clothes and soft voices. The quilt hung on the far wall, taller than me, wider than I had ever imagined it could be. Under the bright lights, the colors shimmered with a kind of defiance that felt almost alive. The curator asked if I'd like to say a few words. My daughter and Greg stood among the crowd, their expressions unreadable. Lily gave me a small nod from across the room, her eyes full of encouragement. I stepped forward, my palms trembling slightly, and for the first time in decades, I spoke to more than a single person at once. I didn't give a speech, not really. I simply said, "Every stitch here was made from something that tried to disappear. Fabric, memory, voice. I only did what women have always done. I refuse to let the small things vanish. The room was silent for a moment, and then came the sound of applause, soft at first, then swelling like rain on a roof. When the lights dimmed later and the crowd thinned, I stood alone before the quilt. I saw my reflection faintly in the glass behind it, my lined face blending with the patterns of thread, and it struck me that I was no longer separate from the thing I had made. I was both the maker and the made, the story and its teller. Greg approached quietly, perhaps thinking I wouldn't notice him. "It's beautiful," he said finally, the words slow, deliberate. I didn't understand before. I turned to look at him. "Understanding isn't required," I said gently. "Respect is enough." He nodded, and for once, didn't argue. My daughter joined him, taking his hand. She looked at me with eyes that were neither proud nor pitying, but something more complicated. Something like recognition. She said softly, "I'm sorry we made you feel small." I smiled, not to dismiss her, but to tell her that the apology had already been received by the work itself. "You didn't make me small," I said. "You just forgot how big I was." That night, back home, I set the singer on the table once more. The house felt different now, still quiet, but no longer lonely. I ran a drop of oil along the metal, the scent sharp and comforting. I didn't plan to sew again. Not yet. I only wanted to hear the sound of the motor, that familiar hum that had carried me through grief and laughter, through invisibility and defiance. When I pressed the pedal, the machine answered at once, steady and sure. The sound filled the room, soft but unstoppable, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. It was the sound of creation, of resistance, of life refusing to go silent. I realized then that the true work was not the quilt, not even the applause, but this moment, the unbroken hum of a woman who had finally learned to listen to herself. The house feels lighter now, as if something invisible has been lifted from its beams, a pressure that once settled into the corners and made the air hesitate before it moved. Morning light falls through the lace curtains in a way that feels deliberate, slow, generous, like a visitor who finally understands she is welcome. I wake without the dull resistance that used to cling to me, that old reluctance to meet a day that belonged to everyone but me. The singer sits in its usual place by the window, polished and quiet, a sentinel rather than a tool. And every time I glance at it, I feel the same steady gratitude that people must feel when they look at a well-tended grave. Sorrow folded neatly into reverence. I have stopped sewing for now. The work has been done, the thread spent. But sometimes, at night, I still touch the pedal lightly with my toe. Just enough to coax a soft murmur from the motor, like the heartbeat of a memory that refuses to fade. The sound is not loneliness. It is proof that something faithful remains. The quilt returned home last week. The gallery sent it back wrapped in layers of tissue paper and careful compliments, as though afraid that the very act of touching it might unmake it. I unwrapped it slowly, savoring the dry whisper of paper, and when the last fold fell away, I saw that they had mounted a small brass plaque on one corner. "Hands That Remember" by Evelyn Hart. The name startled me. It looked so formal, so public, so unlike the woman who once stood trembling in her own kitchen while a man half her age laughed at the machine that built her life. Yet there it was, my name in engraved letters, steady as if it had always belonged there. I ran my fingertips over the cool surface of the plaque, and thought of all the times I had been told that what I did was ordinary, domestic, invisible. It stretches across the far wall, a tide of color against the pale paint, its patterns catching light differently with each hour. Sometimes I sit opposite it in the evenings and watch how the setting sun drifts across its surface, illuminating one story and then another, the way memory itself does, never all at once. The dark center still pulls the eye, but it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like gravity, something necessary to hold the rest together. When Lily visited yesterday, she stood before it for a long time and then said, "It looks alive." I told her it was. She laughed softly and slipped her arm through mine. "You know they're studying it in my art theory class?" she said. "They're calling it intergenerational reclamation." The phrase made me laugh. So many big words to describe what was really an old woman deciding she would no longer disappear. But I let her have her language. She needed her own way of understanding. My daughter visits more often now, always bringing something: flowers, groceries, an apology disguised as conversation. She talks less about condos and more about recipes, about how she wishes she had learned to cook the stews I made in the winters of her childhood. Once, she even asked if I might teach her how to sew. Just the basics. We sat together for an hour, the fabric stretched between us, her fingers awkward on the needle, mine guiding gently. Not to correct, but to steady. She pricked her finger once and laughed at the small bead of blood. And I told her that every woman who sews learns that creation asks for a little sacrifice. For a moment, she looked at me with the open, trusting face she used to have before adulthood taught her to disguise affection as efficiency. When she left that evening, she hugged me longer than usual. Greg waited in the car. He waved through the windshield, tentative but genuine. I waved back, and the gesture felt like closing a chapter, not with punctuation, but with breath. The neighborhood has changed little, though the seasons continue their polite revolutions. The maple tree outside my window is beginning to turn again, its leaves curling at the edges, the first hints of amber tracing the green. On quiet afternoons, I sit with a cup of tea and listen to the children from 2 doors down ride their bikes in the street, their voices rising and falling in unguarded joy. Sometimes the woman who moved there, the one in the blue cardigan, stops by with a slice of cake or a story about her garden, and we talk the way old women do, in loops and half-finished thoughts. The comfort of shared solitude filling the spaces. Between words, she has at night, when the world outside grows still and the lamps cast their golden pools across the floor, I think about the quiet forms of redemption. I used to believe that forgiveness was something you gave to others, a gift or surrender. But I see now that it is mostly the act of refusing to keep carrying what was never truly yours. I no longer rehearse old arguments in my head, no longer imagine sharper words I could have said. The past feels settled, not erased but catalogued, like fabric folded and stored in its proper place. There are moments, of course, when the old ache returns, when I remember the sharpness of laughter, the chill of being dismissed, but the feeling passes quickly, leaving only the faint hum of gratitude. I am grateful that I lived long enough to become the narrator of my own story instead of its casualty. Sometimes I wonder what will happen to the singer when I'm gone. Machines outlive people. That is their quiet talent. Perhaps Lily will take it, or perhaps it will rest here, silent but dignified, waiting for another pair of hands that understand rhythm more than instruction. I have written a small note and slipped it into the drawer beneath the machine. She still works. Keep her clean. Listen to her hum before you begin. I like to think someone will find it one day, open the drawer, and feel that small thrill of discovery that comes when the past extends its hand toward the present. Before I go to bed, I make a habit of walking through the house, touching the things that remain: walls, table, the back of a chair, the frame of the window. It's a ritual now, a way of saying thank you to the inanimate witnesses of a life reclaimed. I stop by the singer, place my hand on the smooth metal, and whisper good night as if it were a companion. Sometimes I tell her stories of the world beyond this house, how people now speak of her as art, how her hum once filled rooms with defiance and grace. And then I smile because she does not need to know any of that. She already knows everything that matters. The night is long, but it is kind. The wind brushes against the windows like a familiar visitor, and the moonlight lays soft lines across the quilt. I sit at the edge of my bed and watch it breathe in the shadows, a living map of all that was lost and found again. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, I feel the quiet certainty that nothing truly made with love ever disappears. I close my eyes, and the world hums its steady note, the same sound that comes from the singer when it's just about to begin, that promise that even after the last stitch, there is always another line waiting to be sewn.